Hi, everybody, and welcome to the webinar by N0 and Styra. We're going to talk about policy as code and infrastructure as code and the combination between. We'll give the people a few minutes to join before we start. So stay tuned. We're going to give people another minute or two to join before we'll start.
Sounds good.
Okay, we'll start within a minute. Okay, we're gonna start. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Omry. I'm the CTO and co-founder of N0. N0 is a platform to manage all of your infrastructure as code. And today we are going to talk about Open Policy Agent and Policy as Code, and the interaction with infrastructure as code as well. And together with me is Andres for Styra. Nice to have you here.
Thanks, Henri. That's very good to be here. Yeah, I'm Anders. I work as the the I'm leading developer relations at Styra. I've been involved in all things around OPA and kind of for both on the other side as like a end user customer and eventually working for Styra. And I've been here for 4 years now. I worked with OPA for I think almost 6 years by now. And before that, I have a background in identity systems. Basically what got me interested in OPA is once you know who somebody is, like how do you determine what they can do, and so on. And at the time, I was in a platform team, so that that kind of led me into OPA for other reasons because we had a need to define like restrictions and limits and so on for what our developers could deploy to production and things like security rules, but also try to avoid like people doing things by mistake or accidentally doing things they didn't mean to do. So yeah, it's both. And I think that's kind of an interesting aspect of policy, and especially for infrastructure, because I think what it most often protects you from is actually yourself. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
like there's a risk of pushing like something a misconfiguration that leaves you open, but I think most people have probably not endured a hacker attack, but most people have done something stupid that that either cost a lot of money or was really embarrassing. So yeah, policy serves a lot of purposes, and infrastructure is certainly no exception.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the importance of policy is that you want to control stuff that happens. And I think in the real world you have policies all around, even if it's not like strict like policy as code, but you have policies within the workspace or your family or wherever. And also when you use other SaaS platform like Gmail or GitHub or stuff like that, you also have policies within those SaaS platform, and basically in order to control and have the ability to know exactly what's going to happen. So let's take GitHub, for example. If you open a pull request, something you have policy that you cannot merge it unless somebody approves it or all the checks are valid. So you have policies within the entire workflow of your developer. And I think we need to understand that that's something that we have to have, especially when it's the infrastructure that you can cause a lot of damage. As you mentioned, everybody has their story of how they broke production, if it's security or cost or just, bugs or stuff that you've done. And I
Yeah,
think that's like the main challenge. And maybe you can talk a bit about like what Styra and open policy is about and what's the thing that you are after.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'd actually like to continue on what you said there, but about policies being everywhere. It's I'm you can't really choose like whether to use policies or not, or whether to
Hmm.
work with policies or not. They're going to be everywhere, like in any systems you interact with, like the systems you build, but also the systems you use are going to have policies and all sorts of ways to manage, configure those policies, and so on. So the kind of concept of open policy agent is that there should be one way, ideally, to describe policy regardless of your use case or environment and so on. And I think that idea, like almost a decade after OPA, there's still not a whole lot of competitors doing that, or
Hmm.
other like open source projects or so on. Like there's a lot of policy engines emerging for all these different use cases where you say like, yeah, for authorization, use this, for infrastructure, you can use this. But I think that is largely missing the point of OPA. Is like you want to consolidate this, and the larger your organization or enterprise is, the more important that is going to be because having all these different technologies to do basically the same thing is expensive and it's complex. So that is basically what OPA is. But on a more like technical level, Open Policy Agent is a policy engine. It basically means you load rules and data into OPA. And I say OPA now, but that's how we'll the short
Yeah,
name for Open
I
Policy
think
Agent.
everybody
Yeah,
is using Opera
yeah,
right now.
yeah.
It's not like
No, for sure.
uh
And it is used in like I'd say that most of the large enterprises in the world.
mhm.
Uh, So the idea is basically you load a policy, and now after you've done that, you can start to query OPA. So OPA has all these rules loaded, which could be like any doctor can view medical records, but only on their own patients and not like anybody.
Mhm.
So once you've loaded a rule like that into OPA, then you can start to ask questions or queries. So now you can say like, I am a doctor. Can I view the medical records of this patient? And then OPA makes a decision. So basically it says yes or no, or it could be more elaborate. It could be like a complex decision with many like obligations or whatnot. And of
Mhm.
course, in the context of infrastructure, a policy would often say something like you're not allowed to publish like S3 buckets if like open to the wild world.
Mhm.
There's going to be like limits or certain security configurations for Kubernetes pods or whatever it might be. And then basically you have systems like uh, open tofu or so on, where you can say like, here's my infrastructure specification. Does this comply to our policy? And then OPA can say yes, it does, because it there's no violations here, or it can say no. And of course, if it just says no, you don't really know what to fix. So in
Mhm.
that case, it's but a decision can be basically be any JSON data. So you can come back with a list and say here's all the things that you need to fix and so on. And once you have that knowledge, you can bring that over to another domain, or like Kubernetes or access control or CI/CD and so on. So that is basically the idea. OPA uses a policy language called Rego.
Mhm.
Uh, and as with anything else, like learning something new, there's always a certain it always takes some time and effort, but that is the point. Like it that pays off, and of course, the more you invest in this, if you use OPA everywhere, it's like it's gonna pay off even more. So
Yeah.
so yeah, that was a short introduction to OPA, I think.
Yeah. And I think in terms of the infrastructure as code, I think, today all of the big enterprise and a lot of organization uses infrastructure as code. And I think it's a very powerful tool in one hand, but it's something that can cause a lot of issues and a lot of problems, because, you have the ability to write code and then run it, and then you can either create like a security concern or a cost concern, or just bugs or performance issues that you might create, and you want something or someone that controls about like what policies and how do you do that. Sometimes it's like tags, because you want to define those resources with different tags so you can build them to the specific team or user that created it. You want to do approval policies and so on. So it can be, as you mentioned, complex. And as I mentioned, infrastructure as code is a powerful tool, but with those powerful things, you can create a lot of damage. So you want to have something under control. And I think Open Policy Agent is basically the standard way now to create those policies within your infrastructure and make sure that everything is compliant and everything is the standards that you want. And as you mentioned, you can do complex things. It's not like only if an S3 bucket is open, you can say, hey, if it's something that is this, you can ask somebody else to approve it, or there's a lot of ways to interact with the Open Policy Agent. Um, maybe we
Certainly.
can talk, yeah, maybe we can talk a bit about like Rego, and why did you choose that, and why it's like the tool of choice within Styra, and then how the learning curve that you started talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. I think like we had to have a policy language, or we had to have some language.
Mm,
So one idea is, of course, like, can't we use a language like Python or JavaScript, whatever? And that's a very common question, and it's a good question, of course. Like, why don't we do that?
Mm-hmm.
And I just to answer that, like one of the reasons, there are many reasons for not doing that, but one of the reasons is of course like in the context of policy, which is often deployed in like highly sensitive, like secure, high security context, and so on. You need a language that comes with certain guarantees. Like you can't have a path that ends up in like infinite recursion or like that can have any user read from the file system or so on. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
there could be other ways to accomplish this with like high sandboxing using other technologies and so on. But I think that is one of the benefits of having your own language, where you can kind of set up the confines or limits of what the language can do.
Mm-hmm.
So that is definitely one reason. Bringing in a whole programming language to do policy would be, yeah, it could work, but it would be very problematic. And
Mm-hmm.
if if you did that and you had to limit what that language could do, it's like, is it still the same language, or would people like just feel like it was just a very poor version of Python or whatnot? So that is one reason. Uh, and another reason is, of course, that Rego kind of plays on the strengths of what policy is. So you want to be able to read a Rego policy and have it read pretty much like what is a policy? Like a policy is basically a list or a set of rules. And when you read a Rego policy, that is basically what you get. So that is another reason. It's like a good match to describe
Mm-hmm.
policy, really.
Um, cool. And another thing is maybe we can talk about like practical examples that you see. We see a lot of customers that are using Open Policy Agent for approval policies. So basically, if something, if you want to deploy something to production, you want the DevOps team or the SRE team to approve it, or if it's a specific change to like a security group, you want maybe the security team to approve it, or maybe create like different policies in terms of cost. How what do you see as as a practical example from the real world, from your customers and your experience with the OPA?
Sure. I think like yeah, I'd say there are the two main groups that we see a lot of is like it's either access control or infrastructure policy or the infrastructure as code. Uh, and they're like, even though we have this common policy engine, this common policy language and so on, it's still fairly different in how these two communities use OPA. And one difference is, of course, I'd say like access control is much more secretive. Like there isn't like you can't find like thousands of OPA policies online on public GitHub
Mm-hmm.
where you see like how they implement authorization or RBAC or ABAC or so on. Because OPA in that context often used by banks, financial institutions, and so on. So that those kind of policies are often private, whereas with infrastructure, it's perfectly public because having these requirements are so common, and the schema of the data, like a Terraform plan or OpenTofu or what's that AWS cloud formation.
Cloud
It's like
formation.
what it's gonna look like. Here's what an S3 bucket looks like, or here's an EC2 instance. So it's super simple to kind of share and reuse policies from that use case. Whereas with access control, you have a
Mm-hmm.
mainframe somewhere at the bank, and there's like an old database, or there's like so many different systems to interact with, and there's not a whole lot of schemas that yeah, basically that people have agreed on. And we're even though there's been a few attempts to consolidate on that, I think the fact is that it's going to be very different how that looks. So I think that is a really good thing with like policy in the context of infrastructure, is that you don't have to do this all Like you don't have to reinvent this from scratch. And I think like sure there might be a learning curve to anything Rego, so but if you're using OPA in this context, like it would surprise me if you had to write at least unless you have like complex requirements and very specific to your organization. Like these policies are already written and they're mostly on GitHub. So that yeah, I'd still recommend learning, of course, because it's pretty good to know what a policy does and so on. But uh, that is definitely one of the real kind of benefits of OPA in this context.
Yeah, I think the infrastructure as code as a whole is a community that shares a lot of the challenges that everybody has.
Yep,
Because everybody, as you mentioned, it's the same code base or the same output, so everybody can share that, and there's nothing wrong on how do you define an S3 bucket? Everybody probably doing this the same,
sure. Yeah.
and yeah, and there's like different aspects for each company, but as a general, it's basically the same. So I think the community with the let's take open source for Terraform, with the providers and the modules is very vast, and there's a lot of things that go hand to hand with open policy agent that is also open source, and you can share a lot of the stuff. So it makes sense that there's a lot of community. And before you, as you mentioned, before you go and write your own policy, go check if somebody else already did it, and maybe did it better than what you've
Yeah. Yeah.
you thought about. Cool. So I know there's a new version of Open Policy Agent that you are going to release. So maybe you can talk about a bit about that and what's the difference between the old version compared to the new version.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. It's been released actually. It was released here. I think it was December, just before Christmas. So OPA 1.0 was released. So our first major version, which is kind of late, given that it's I think 9 years since the first commit, and 10 years this year. Uh, but
Congratulations.
yeah, better late than never.
Yeah.
So yeah, it isn't as big as it might sound like, or I think it's what we basically try to do here is we worked hard on just making things that were previously like opt-in, things that we saw like this isn't gonna improve the overall like experience working with Rego. And they were all available before. You just had to import them, make enable, and so on. We just said like this is going to be from now on. This is the default, uh, and we spent a lot of time to allow like going in the other direction because we wanted everyone to be able to upgrade. And even if you can't change all your policies at once, you can basically say like, hey, I still want to run these old policies, even using like the latest OPA.
Hmm.
So that's kind of backwards compatibility was really important for us, and that has been something we worked a lot to achieve. We were really keen not to have this kind of Python 2.2.3 thing where it's like, yeah, years of people arguing and having issues, and then like and still not upgrading. So we wanted to make sure that the path to go from one version to another was as smooth as possible. Uh, and yeah, just to give a quick kind of demo, I prepared to your left side, or at least to my left side. It's actually I'll mark it here if in case it's not. So to the left, it's basically a version one of a simple policy. This policy, and I'm actually going to read it from on the right side here because I think that it kind of makes it obvious how much easier it is to read. So again, I told you before, a policy is a set of rules, and here we have a rule that says we allow if the user is admin, or allow if the user is on call. So we have those are basically the two conditions which can make OPA allow something. And allow in this case is just a Boolean. So we say like allow is going to be true or it's not going to be true. And yeah, so basically the constructs here, these two do exactly the same thing. It just shows that like you get using less code, you can express the same things, but keywords like if, contains, and so on kind of contribute to just making the policy easier to read and easier to write. And I think that is the key takeaway, or what we wanted to accomplish with the language upgrade.
Yeah, it seems like, the same set of rules, 20 something line of codes compared to
Exactly,
14.
it gets more kind of,
It's
you can write it in more kind of compact, but we're not doing like code golf. We still want it to be like very clear what's going on.
yeah,
But just a few keywords made things a lot more readable.
yeah, more natural
More
basically to the
natural,
user.
exactly.
Yeah. Great. So I wanted to take us to talk about like N0 and how we integrate with Open Policy Agent. So let me share my screen and talk a bit about like how do we do that. This is the N0 platform. I'll talk a bit about like what is are you looking at. So basically with N0, we are managing all of your infrastructure as code. And one of the things that we have is project, and each project is assigned to like a specific cloud account, and you have like specific role-based access. And one thing is that you have within the project setting is the approval policies that basically you connect to your open policy code. In this case, is a GitHub repository, and this is like the path to the open policy code. And when you do that, you also have the ability to inheritance. So with us, we have project and sub-project, and it can be inheritance. So if you basically define a policy within the parent project, the child project will get that automatically. And you can add as many policies as you want, and we'll basically apply all of those and then write a summary for that. So let's go ahead and try to deploy using a template, a front-end EC2 server that has like a few policies. And here you need to define the name and the workspace. But what is something that you cannot do is actually approve the plan automatically, because we have policy agent installed on this project, which means that the policy will control the approval of that specific deployment. So let's go ahead and run it. And in the meantime, let's go ahead and see how it looks like. So in this case, I have a policy that defines cost controls. That basically means that if my deployments will exceed $15, basically you'll need approval from a specific team, the FinOps team. And in this case, I can see that the OpenTofu plan will create an EC2 instance in AWS with like IPs. And then what I can see is also the cost estimation. We're using InfraCost for that. And I can see that this EC2 instance is going to cost me $27, and the EBS will cost another 80 cents. So in total, it will be $28, which is more than what I've expected. And it means that I need approval from specific team or specific people. And I not only need one approval, I need two approvals. So it won't be enough that one will approve, only two can approve because of this cost control that I have. And basically, I'll get a Slack notification, or the team that needs to approve get a Slack notification. They will go here, find the plan, the cost, and either approve it or cancel it, depending on what you want to do. And let's take a look a bit about the code. The code lies here, and here you can see the cost limit and the cost approver. That's basically the team ID that needs to approve. And there's like input that you can see, and we are basically adding and ingesting the plan and the cost estimation and other stuff like variables into Open Policy Agent. And also you can define a JSON that will automatically add to the policy agent. So you can query it and do whatever you want. And again, in this case, you need two approval if the cost limit is more than $15. Another thing that we are usually do and see is basically sometimes you want to auto approve a deployment if there's no changes to the um, to the resources. And if there are resources change, you want somebody to approve it. So here you can basically set if there's changes, you need somebody to approve it, and if not, no one needs to approve it as well. So there's a few options on how to do that. And as I mentioned, you can also be flexible on what you want to do and what policy you want to have, because basically we ingest everything into your policy agent, the plan, the cost estimation, and as well as the variables that you're using. And also you can inject whenever you want into the policies in order to query and use open policy agents. So that's like a quick overview of how M0 does it. We are going to talk a bit about like questions from the audience. I know we have a poll that you can answer in the webinar itself. So maybe let's take a few questions from the audience. Do we have specific questions?
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah, there's a
so
question there. That was
yeah,
an OPA question. Should I take
yeah,
that?
yeah, go ahead.
How do you see open policy agent evolving in the next few years? Are there any emerging best practices that companies should start adopting now? Yeah, that's a good question.
Mm.
It's always hard to predict what lies ahead, but uh, yeah, I think in terms of my own predictions, I see like more and more kind of seeing the value of thinking of policy not as like a team concern, but an organizational concern, and seeing the benefits of kind of consolidating on this. And I think with all these kind of recent or sort of recent regulations around things, these things are just getting more and more important. And so I think that is a general trend. Like companies that previously would adopt N0 and OPA for infrastructure, like when they look to solve authorization or another problem, it's like, of course, if you already know how to define policies there, like you're gonna want to use that same technology for all these other policy use cases. So that is definitely a trend.
Great.
Another
I
question.
see. Yeah, we have another question. I'll take that. What are the biggest misconceptions about policies code in the cloud infrastructure, and how do you address them with your customers? I think, in my opinion, the biggest misconception is that it's really hard to maintain and write policies in infrastructure as code, and I think it's actually not that hard to do. As we mentioned before, there's a lot of open source and a lot of policies on GitHub and a lot of examples on how to do that. And I think what we're seeing from our customers, our bigger customers, is that you have to have policy as code because that's the way you control and manage your infrastructure, and you want to avoid creating security risk or cost or performance issues. And that's the way to maintain and have enforcements around the entire infrastructure as code and your entire CD or CI/CD pipeline. And I think the biggest misconception is that it's really hard and it's going to take us forever to do that. And I think one, you can do it step by step, read online, try to figure out how do I protect my resources, maybe with just one workspace or one application, and then move forward. And you have a lot of examples and things that you can, as we mentioned before, I think there's a lot of people that write those policies before you and probably thought of a lot of things. So you might want to take that into consideration, and try to find like how to do that in a step by step. But I think the biggest misconception is that it's really hard. And we talked about like Rego and the learning curve. And I think once you get to know it, it's not that hard. It's I can say it's like super simple, but it's not as hard as you think. Um, cool. Any other questions that we might have?
It says here, if not already covered, how is AI adoption going to complement policy as code implementation? Yeah, I think like as any other code, it's definitely subject to people using AI. So far, and I think like one problem with having like with the AI applied to Rego so far has been that again, since a lot of Rego, I'd say probably even like most of the Rego ever written is not it's not on the public internet and hence not like available for training as training data. So there are gaps in what AI or large language models can produce in terms of like quality policies. I think one thing I heard from at a conference recently was somebody using like an LLM to generate Rego, and then had the linter Regal that we have created to kind of to actually to as a policy on his policies. So even if there were mistakes in what was generated, the linter would kind of tell him what those were. So I think that could be like that kind of match is good. And of course, like that linter is also super helpful if you're writing Rego yourself. So highly recommended.
Yeah, and I think the more Rego, maybe within your company that you will write, your GitHub Copilot or any other AI tool will learn or can learn from your specific way to manage the open policy agent. And as time goes by, I believe, AI will be better and do better work in open policy agent and OPA rules. It's a step by step. The bigger languages is probably will become faster, but I think moving forward it will become better and better. And it's a great way to start as well. Instead of trying to figure out, give ChatGPT a try and see what comes of it.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think like for in a high security context, like you're always going to want at least a few people knowing what they're doing. Like you can't entirely off source that to like an AI or I don't think that's ever going to be you kind of need that personal responsibility for that type of code. But I think just like you said, it's a great way to get started and kind of yeah, rather than starting from just a blank page
Yeah.
have an outline that you can work on.
Let's do last question. Maybe you can take that. Insurance and health business verticals have several compliance issues. Any best practices to adopt policy as code?
Uh, yeah, I think I wouldn't say there's anything. It's obviously a main kind of sector or for policy as code, and it's OPA has a lot of use cases there, but I wouldn't say there's anything like really specific. It's basically like for that sector. It's just it's mostly access control really. Uh, so oh, okay. There came another question there, but I think that
Yeah,
was asked really.
yeah,
So mostly access control again. Like what are you allowed to do based on? I think one difference might be that there are a lot more complex rules when it comes to like healthcare or even if you are a doctor and you have all these permissions, like you might not be able to have all access if you're not on site in your hospital. Like you can't do it from your hammock at your
yeah.
cottage or whatever. So there's things like location or what time of the day is it and so on. There's a lot more kind of data involved in many of these decisions. So that would be like, if there's one thing that kind of differentiate that kind of policy, it would be that.
I I can try to say that in in the data world, maybe you can also have policies on what you write and where to, because sometimes you want to have like the PII stuff in a certain place or in a certain region or a specific country, and you can basically do that with Open Policy Agent. Make sure nobody writes PII of like Germany into US or vice versa.
Yeah.
So you can do that with open policies as well, with your data and where you write it to.
Yeah, and it seems like recent developments, we're gonna see a lot more of of that kind.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. So we're gonna wrap things up here. Thank you everybody for joining, and thank you, Andres, for having you in the webinar.
Thanks,
It's been
Omri.
really fun talking to you. And
Likewise.
hopefully, we'll see each other in the future. Maybe in KubeCon.
Yeah,
Yes.
we'll see you there.
Bye everybody, and have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.